the skin is a circadian light sensing organ. And so it doesn't inherently make sense that full spectrum sunlight causes melanoma, BCC, SCC, any form of skin cancer, because there's a lot more to the story. And even further to that point is all anti-cancer processes designed to protect you against cancer are under circadian control. So autophagy, apoptosis, tumor suppression, cell cycle checkpoints, all of them are under circadian control. And now that we know that sunlight is the most powerful Zeitgeber, or external circadian cue, which creates alignment in the circadian system, then that follows the philosophy that it creates alignment in all the anti-cancer processes in the body.
Welcome to Meat Matters with Jenny Mitich, your go-to podcast for everything related to animal-based lifestyles and optimizing your metabolic health. Today's guest is Zaid Dahhaj. Zaid is a circadian optimization coach, writer, and co-founder of the 2 a.m. podcast. His passion for circadian biology and its impact on health began when his father passed away from heart disease at the age of 51. Since then, he's dedicated himself to communicating and teaching the powerful connection between the body's natural rhythms and optimal health. Zaid is wicked intelligent, and he knows so much about circadian biology and circadian rhythms and everything related to sunlight. So if this is a topic that's interesting to you, you're going to love this interview. As always, if you end up enjoying this podcast, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you would like to take your support a step further, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating on whatever podcast app you're listening on. By getting more positive ratings, we're going to be able to get this podcast out to more and more people. And with that, let's dive into this interview with Zaid Dahhaj. All right, today I have a very special guest on Meat Matters. I first learned of our guest from Dr. Lisa Wiedemann. I just interviewed her a couple of weeks ago, and she is really going on like a sunlight kick. And she told me during that interview that she thinks that sunlight is just as important as nutrition. And this is one of the people that she's been following to learn more about it. So today I have Zaid Dahhaj. Very excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and we'll get into a really fun discussion here.
Yes, definitely. So can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into circadian biology and all that in the first place?
Sure. So I don't have any centralized or mainstream accreditation, or however you say the word, to my name. No degree, no PhD, nothing like that. I am really a believer in decentralized philosophy in the sense that I think my obsession can carry me through in terms of understanding a lot of the stuff with circadian biology. And so for me, starting with, being an athlete since the age of 4, playing competitive soccer, I've always had some degree of interest in health because that always translated into my performance on the field. Fast forward to about 25, 26 years after that was when my father experienced 2 heart attacks within the span of a year. So the second one, myocardial infarction, put him into a coma. He was in hospice, and then that eventually led to his passing. And that's essentially what got me hooked on general health. But then a few years after that, after diving through all the health fundamentals, I found circadian biology. And from there, it's taken on a life of its own, and I've been absolutely obsessed with it. And I think it resonates with me most of all because I do like to view health from a first principle standpoint. And so I do believe that the circadian realm is the keystone pillar of health that controls everything from detox to nutritional, feedback to biofeedback, everything in between.
That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm the same. My college degree is in business and finance, but I've been obsessed with nutrition since 2016. I first learned about it through a Joe Rogan podcast with Mark Sisson on it. And then I bought all of his books, read them all, and I've just been going down that rabbit hole ever since. And yeah, I think, college has a value to it, but also I think that passion, like you said, and following those rabbit holes of what you're really interested in, you know more about circadian rhythm and biology and all of that than a lot of the doctors that I read and talk to. So I don't think you need a degree in order to be an expert on something.
Yeah. And I've received a lot of pushback in terms of like, oh, well, you could go to college and I guess create a more well-rounded education. But I think within the realm that I am in with circadian biology, there is no curriculum on that. And especially when it comes to the more cutting edge things, whether it be vitiligo or eyesight regeneration, a lot of that stuff is really fringe and, to be honest, looked down upon within the mainstream narrative.
For sure. Yeah. So how do you conduct your research? How have you been able to dive so deep into this topic? Like, what are you reading? What are you diving into?
Yeah, so I will mostly just go through PubMed or NCBI, various databases or journals that offer a lot of different studies. And the tough thing is that, of course, you're not going to gather a complete understanding of the truth from looking at one to even 100 studies. In my mind, I have to piece a lot of this together using first principles biology and circadian biology. And so I mainly do that, but I'll find myself interested in various topics in relation to the circadian realm. So, over the past week, I've been going into cancer and circadian biology. Other weeks, I'll go into thyroid health or skin health or something of that nature. And so it's very spontaneous in that sense. I don't like to be very rigid in terms of how I study. And it's also very eclectic because, I'm that person who has like 100 tabs open with various aspects of the work and trying to, piece everything together.
Yeah, I'm the same. I am in the middle of probably like 10 different books on different topics that all apply to what I'm passionate about, but I like to keep it fresh. So that's fun. I think we kind of study and research in the same way. So when you're looking at the general population, let's just say of Americans today, what's wrong with the way that people are treating sun exposure?
Mm. There's a lot wrong for sure. I think that if we're looking at how society is built by default, it is a it is a societal structure that essentially creates circadian disruption. So people are spending 90 to 95% of their time indoors. They go from the house to the car to the office and very rarely go outside in the circadian sense or framework. And so that's a major problem just out the gate. You have people who are typically not tanning, who are told to avoid sun exposure when there's high UV, and who I think are not given a proper circadian education from first principles to understand what to do in their lifestyle. And so essentially, if I were to break this down to its core, people have dark days because they spend most of their time indoors during the day, and then they have really bright nights. And so that is kind of that's circadian disruption, explained really well, because essentially you want that distinction of bright days outside and then dark nights with minimal circadian lighting once nightfall occurs. And so essentially it's flipped, which is very problematic for a circadian creature that has every aspect of its body tuned to the circadian system and light specifically.
Okay, so for the vast majority of the population, then what effects does this have on them?
I mean, you point out to any single chronic disease model, and it will have a direct relationship to that. So, these darker days and brighter nights will lead to the development of type 2 diabetes. It'll create pre-diabetes. Glucose homeostasis and insulin are fundamentally under circadian control. Heart disease, again, the heart and circadian biology is a very strong. It has a very strong relationship to one another. And I think it's helpful to understand that every aspect of the body is circadian in nature. So every organ, that means your liver, your heart, your brain, your eyes, all of this is under circadian control. And so the second and third order consequences are basically countless in my mind. Any sort of manifestation can result from circadian disruption. And that's very important to understand because it ties into whether you want to prevent chronic disease, whether you want to improve performance if you're an athlete. So it has this it has a lot of leverage in terms of its ability to be applied to various subjects.
Interesting. I feel like, yeah, a lot of people in my audience, in my space, they have a lot of things dialed in, but then the sun comes in and it's just like, so I'm wondering how much of that is related to why they still have certain chronic conditions or problems, even losing weight. Have you seen in any of your research anything to do with circadian rhythms and being in tune with it and weight regulation?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, if you talk about like the POMC system, the pro-opium-melanocortin system, that is a system that fundamentally responds to UV light and the full spectrum, and it creates the most powerful peptide hormones that we know of in response to that UV light signal to the eyes and into the skin. And so some of those are, the MSH family, melanocyte stimulating hormone, beta endorphin, which is an opioid peptide. CART is kind of similar in that respect. And all of these strike at the heart of metabolism, and they strike at the heart of appetite regulation, satiety, the interplay between leptin and ghrelin. So I think it is really key and central to this whole discussion of obesity and body weight, composition in general.
It's really interesting. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit later. I have some questions about what people can do to improve their relationship with the sun and get their circadian biology back in sync with the way it's supposed to be. But I want to talk a little bit about some other things first. Our entire lives, we've heard that you need to slather on sunscreen when you're going out, in the sun to avoid skin cancer. Why? Why were we told that, and why is that wrong?
I think it's a problem. It's probably a threefold problem. Number one, I think the research linking full spectrum sunlight to skin cancers is very flawed. I've often talked about how centralized medicine suffers from myopia in terms of its reductionist philosophy to applied to biological systems in sunlight. And so they're using isolated UV on nocturnal animals in an artificially blue lit lab with a lot of non-native EMF around. And that's as far divorced from nature as you can get. That doesn't tell us what happens when full spectrum sunlight hits or interacts with the circadian species, aka human beings. That's, I think, the first problem. There's also some inherent corruption in my mind going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s with various companies like L'Oreal, Nestle, creating these PR campaigns to basically get people to fear the sun so that they buy more of their products. And that's well documented historically. And then the second part of the problem, I would say, is just not understanding the relationship between full spectrum sunlight and the skin barrier. The skin is a circadian light sensing organ. And so it doesn't inherently make sense that full spectrum sunlight causes melanoma, BCC, SCC, any form of skin cancer, because there's a lot more to the story. And even further to that point is all anti-cancer processes designed to protect you against cancer are under circadian control. So autophagy, apoptosis, tumor suppression, cell cycle checkpoints, all of them are under circadian control. And now that we know that sunlight is the most powerful Zeitgeber, or external circadian cue, which creates alignment in the circadian system, then that follows the philosophy that it creates alignment in all the anti-cancer processes in the body. And then I think thirdly, you have the problem with sunscreen actually changing the full light spectrum from the sun in similar ways that low emission glass does. And that is highly problematic in my mind, because you always want to maintain the spectrum in its full glory, because we don't really understand how powerful the synergy is between these wavelengths in their perfect proportion. And I think we get into some real problems when we do start to isolate wavelengths and break them apart. So there's a lot more to the story, but I think that the centralized narrative is really built on some very flawed assumptions.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the different wavelengths. Can you touch on what are those wavelengths? Because I think everyone knows UVA, UVB. What else is there?
Yeah, so we'll start with UV. So UV typically only makes up about 3 to 5% of the solar spectrum at all times, no matter where you are, even at the equator. And that is consisted of UVA, UVB. Both have independently like a shocking level of health benefit for the human body. And then you also get into UVC, which technically doesn't make it through our atmosphere, but our own bodies produce UVC in the form of biophotons. So your mitochondria essentially make light through their metabolism. So that's the UV. Then you get into the visible part of the spectrum that includes red, yellow, green, orange, purple, and all of those wavelengths independently offer benefit for the human body. But of course, considering it's a synergistic model, it ends up creating more benefit that is reflected than just studying any wavelength in isolation. And then outside of that, you have infrared, which I think makes up about 70% of the solar spectrum from a photon standpoint. And so infrared is really what makes up most of the spectrum here, around 50 to 55%. And I forgot to mention that visible is like 42 to 45%. But either way, you look at infrared through the scientific literature, it shows incredible benefits from regenerating the skin barrier, stopping melanoma proliferation, actually activating blood flow independent of other factors as well. So it gets quite deep, but I think that's a good overview of the solar spectrum in general.
And then just kind of a side question, with like red light therapy is really popular. What is that utilizing? What's wavelengths and spectrums?
It'll depend on the manufacturer, but I think typically people will use like 630 nanometers, which is in the red. And then I think they get into the near infrared, which is like probably around 700 plus. And there's a specific cutoff point, but typically red and near infrared are what's used.
Okay. And then you were talking about the sunlight coming through a pane of glass. Why is that not good? Like, I know a lot of people will be like, oh, but I stand by a window all day. Am I not getting enough sunlight? Can you talk about that? Because you had a post on your Instagram that was just showed it so just clearly, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's a very important subject that I think most people don't know about, but we want to maintain the sun's full spectrum because of the fact that this synergistic relationship between the wavelengths create an effect that is larger than the independent wavelengths themselves. And so the problem with modern glass is that it's low emission glass typically. Most of the new cars, most of the new buildings, all of it is geared around low emission because they essentially want to save energy, because they want to prevent, indoor buildings from being heated too much, and then that would lead to excess use of AC and whatnot. And so it's geared around energy savings and climate and stuff like that. But that low emission glass is actually made to change the sun's full spectrum. And so so it's very important to understand that full spectrum sunlight is not the same as sunlight filtered through this low emission glass. So typically what it will do is focus UVA and blue light in isolation together, which is a very damaging combination for the skin barrier. It'll destroy collagen, elastin, hyaluronic acid. In my opinion, it will contribute to skin cancer. And then it will dramatically reduce the red and infrared, which I view as these protective balancing mechanisms within the full spectrum. And then it'll typically block most of UVB. This also depends on whether you're passenger side, driver side, or windshield, because windshields typically block full UVA and UVB. But either way, you want to avoid direct skin contact when sunlight is filtered through this glass because of its damaging effect on the skin barrier. And this intuitively makes sense. Like, as a circadian species, we never evolved to get, this filtered spectrum of light. We always evolved to get it as a full spectrum. And so I think that is a very good explanation of it. And it's also reflected in the scientific literature. The dermatologist will tell you to avoid sunlight through glass in the same way that I will.
Yeah. I'll flash the photo up on the screen now. It's of a man that was a truck driver, and this side of his face that was on the driver's side was just so wrinkly and just sun damaged, and this side was just normal aging, and that was from years of this effect. But how was that photo used in marketing to kind of distort what was actually happening?
Well, centralized dermatology typically just blames the sun for that, but they don't consider low emission glass, and they have no understanding of what low emission glass does to the full spectrum, nor do they understand what the full spectrum is all about and, the relationship to that in relation to circadian biology.
It was really, really interesting. I noticed that when I'm driving, I always have a light, cardigan or something on my arm because I burn much faster through glass. I've noticed that, and we do a lot of road trips. We do Airstream RVing stuff. So I always have that with me because it's real. It is definitely real. I am happy to announce that my new book, Complete Carnivore, is now available for pre-order. Complete Carnivore is an in-depth guide to the carnivore diet along with 80 plus carnivore recipes. And they're not just like cooking meat recipes. There's recipes for carnivores at any stage of their journey, and it definitely helps you mix it up a little bit if you're getting bored on the carnivore diet. When I was writing this book, I was really aiming to make this like the encyclopedia of the carnivore diet, and I am super excited for you to read it. Pre-sales are a huge deal for any first-time author, so if you'd like to show your support for me in any way, please consider pre-ordering this book. I will put the links in the show notes. Amazon and Barnes & Noble both have really good pre-order deals, where you will get the lowest price the book ever was from the time that you pre-order it to the time it's released. So let's say, for example, Amazon has a flash sale on my book and you've already pre-ordered it, but then it goes down in price to like $20. Well, on release day, you will pay that $20 lowest price because you had already pre-ordered the book. Also, the book typically ships on release day, so you get it right away. Let's get this book onto every bookstore shelf in America and share the healing power of the carnivore diet with the world. Pre-order links are in the show notes, and I thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. I want to talk a little bit about sunglasses. Why should people avoid wearing sunglasses as much as they can? Now, I will say this with the caveat that I used to wear my sunglasses religiously, to the point where like I couldn't even take them off because it was so bright. But after starting following you, I've really been trying not to wear them really as much as I possibly can. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there are a few different perspectives on this. I think that if we follow the idea that the eyes and the brain are one system and act as a circadian organ that is designed to get the full spectrum in, then it doesn't make sense that we inherently need sunglasses in order to protect the eye from ocular diseases or any of these other symptoms or manifestations. So that's one part to it. The entire ocular system is essentially built around light sensing mechanisms. So there's a high amount of mitochondria within the eye. Those are light sensing organelles that respond to the full spectrum of sunlight and are also damaged by isolated blue. You have non-visual photoreceptors, which are light sensing proteins that are specifically designed to basically look for or sense different wavelengths of light in the environment. And then you have melanin, which is, one of the most incredible biopolymers in nature. And it basically absorbs most of the sun's full spectrum, UV specifically. So that's like the first principles understanding. All of those things follow a circadian rhythm. And what happens is when you start to use sunglasses chronically, which most people do, is that they basically mess up that entire process. So not only are people more susceptible to burning because they're blocking that UV light signal into the eyes peripherally, which then activates the POMC system, which then makes MSH, which then makes melanin, which acts as a protective mechanism, or Mother Nature's most perfect sunscreen. Then you also get into the discussion of light sensitivity, which I think is a big one. And that is really where you see the downregulation of melanopsin function in these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And then you see the downregulation of dopamine production in the eye. And so melanopsin and dopamine are supposed to work together in bright conditions and even low light conditions to create photoadaptation within the eye. And so you're basically telling your eyes to avoid doing what they evolved to do, which is problematic because then you're going to start complaining about the light sensitivity. You're not going to be able to go outside without sunglasses, at least initially. And then that can lead to things like headaches, especially with its relationship to, I think, a nerve called the trigeminal nerve. I don't know if that's right. But either way, it's problematic from many different perspectives on that end.
So what would your recommendation be for people that do chronically wear sunglasses? Like how often can they wear them without really affecting that circadian biology?
I think in most people's day-to-day, you don't need them 99% of the time. There are exceptions where if you are in an environment that actively presents glare to you, I believe glare is very damaging to the eyes. So think like on the water, high altitude with snow, desert environments sometimes, or even on the road during sunrise and sunset, to the point where you can't see and it does pose a safety threat. So those are all valid use cases, but keep in mind, to be done very rarely, in my opinion. Outside of that, I just don't see a reason to wear them. If you want to gradually get your eyes in the game and remove the light sensitivity and all the other manifestations, then I think you have to start with that morning sunlight without UV, progressively increase your exposure over time, and then you start to get into the midday bright light exposure where UV is present, and then you just slowly adapt in the same way that you would build a tan through sunbathing. And then I think it is also very important to block isolated blue after sunset and just make it dark, because again, the light and dark cycle is one duality, so we want to make sure we have both of those in check. But either way, I think that should really help people immensely. And I've seen this work for redheads. I've seen it work for blonde individuals with blue eyes. It works across the board, just so long as people put in the circadian foundation.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I've been doing it now for probably about a month, and before I couldn't even take my glasses off without being like, and now I'm pretty good, except for that really, really, really bright sun, and then I'll put it back on. But yeah, I'm making progress, yay. I have a question about eyes. So I wear contacts, and I just discovered within the past few months that they are UV blocking contacts. Now, I've just contacted my eye doctor to try to find some that are not. They do exist, but just, the whole narrative is that UV blocking is good for your eyes. So can you tell me a little bit about that? Is that super detrimental to my health to be wearing contacts or even glasses that are UV blocking?
I think it does have some real consequences. I'm always a believer in informed consent, and so people need to understand the risks and benefits to certain things. With contact lenses, I am always an advocate of getting people off of them because of the risks that they pose. And so usually I'll tell people to go to prescription glasses, and then potentially they could implement a circadian eyesight regeneration protocol. But either way, number one, you have the problem with forever chemicals in contacts. That's one that people really don't think about. Those are very nasty forever chemicals that you don't want in your eye that I think do contribute to other problems. And then fundamentally, you have the fact that most of the contact lenses, as you mentioned, will block, I think, blue and UV. I don't know if blue and UV is standard. I do know that UV is pretty standard for most manufacturers. And that's a problem in the same way that I mentioned that low emission glass is a problem, because you're changing the spectrum in very serious ways. And I can prove this through the fact that, the eyes have those non-visual photoreceptors, and, certain aromatic amino acids within the eye, like phenylalanine, tryptophan, histidine, those are UV light sensing and absorbing mechanisms that actively need UV light peripherally into the eyes to then create some of the most powerful hormones and neurotransmitters that we know of. Like phenylalanine absorbs UV, eventually becomes T3 and T4 thyroid hormones, and then that eventually becomes DOPA, which is melanin, dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenaline. Same story with, I think, tryptophan, which becomes serotonin that gets converted into melatonin. And so it just doesn't make sense that we want to block that UV light. I'm not telling people to look straight at the sun, just be outside without those glasses or contacts. And what was the other aspect of this? Oh, corneal hypoxia is a big problem shown in the literature. And so what happens when a tissue doesn't get enough oxygen? It eventually dies. And so that's why I believe contact lenses, for the most part, for most people, does actually contribute to worse eyesight. And so there are various things that we can do to prevent those issues and to, put your eyes in a position where they can regenerate.
That's really interesting because I've been wearing contacts since I was 13. And I don't think they've been UV blocking since then because I'm 41. I think this was probably within the last 10, 15 years that they've been adding it. But there are a few brands that don't have it. I'm going to work on that. But I just wonder how much that has contributed to my hypothyroid issue. I have Hashimoto's hypothyroid. And yeah, the forever chemicals as well, I'm sure, are not helpful. But just the blocking of the light, I'm wondering if that's maybe one of the reasons why my T3 is so low.
I would not be surprised. I think that if you study the work of what was his name, Fritz Hollwich, sorry, Professor Fritz Hollwich in the early 1900s, he was actually a German ophthalmologist who studied this work. So he studied the relationship of full light spectrum in relation to human beings, but also other species, and he found that there are very real endocrine changes when you either remove or just keep cataracts within the eye. And so, he removed a cataract from, let's say, a human being, and he saw direct changes in terms of cortisol, thyroid hormone, all of this stuff. And so I think that makes complete sense in my mind.
Yeah, it's something that I need to dive into more and kind of figure out how I can design just an N of one experiment, maybe a few different ones where I could test that. It's still something I'm trying to figure out. Moving into lighting. What effects do LED lights have on us? What about screens, the blue light that you have in your house? If we're spending 95% of our time indoors, what effect does that have on us?
Many different effects. I mean, mainly through the mechanism of circadian disruption. So if the circadian system is out of whack or desynchronized, let's say, everything gets impacted through that root cause. And so, you could talk about the fact that isolated blue can actually increase blood sugar and insulin independent of food. That's something I've covered recently that is very shocking to most people when they hear that. Mainly, I think, through circadian disruption of glucose homeostasis. The liver is also impacted in a very big way on that end. And I think it just fundamentally destroys the eyes, brain, skin, every aspect of the body. I mean, there was a study that showed that isolated blue is definitely a threat to dopamine neurons. So this also ties into mental illness or just mental health in general. It's so fundamentally foreign to the circadian system that the body doesn't know what to do with it. And so it ends up creating these issues over the short, medium, and long term. And then outside of that, you also have the problem of flicker. I think that flicker is a big problem people don't think about. You have natural sources of flicker, and then you have unnatural sources. And so the eyes and the brain in general are very sensitive to that really quick flickering from fluorescents or LEDs. And yeah, it's just I truly believe it's probably the biggest cause of chronic disease in society today, which is a pretty controversial statement, but I think the science backs it up.
Yeah. So how is an LED light different than an incandescent? Because when I was growing up, we had incandescent light bulbs, but now they're not allowed. Like they're not sold anymore. I think now they're going to be sold again. But how are they different?
So they are different in their rate of flicker for sure. They are, but I think they're most different in their spectrum. And so when you look at an LED bulb, you have this large spike of blue, but you don't have a balanced spectrum. You essentially don't have any red and infrared as well, which again, I think are the protective mechanisms to blue and UV, which are very high energy wavelengths. And so with an incandescent bulb, you have more of a full spectrum. You have a lot of infrared, even farther than, let's say, 800, 900 nanometers. And so that is very beneficial for us. I will say incandescents you can make the argument that they're still unnatural and they do pose some sort of effect, but I think it's very minimal, especially compared to any standard LED or fluorescent. And so I think it's mainly a problem of the spectrum, which then informs the circadian system either properly or, improperly.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about screens? What is their spectrum? Like TVs, phones, laptops?
Yeah, it's typically going to be the same as LEDs. You have this large spike of blue. That's the common theme with LEDs, fluorescents, any technology, any standard lighting. And that is what's going to cause circadian disruption because we just were not evolved to get isolated blue light. You just won't find it in nature. And so when you look at the sun's full spectrum, you always have blue paired with red and infrared and the other wavelengths fundamentally. And that's a real big problem in my mind. And I think there's also something to be said about the fact that you're just looking at a screen closely for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, and you're not getting this training, so to speak, in terms of distance variation. And so when you're outside, you'll look out to the distance at a far tree, or you'll also look at a leaf close by. And so there's kind of there's training on that end when it comes to distance and visual acuity.
So if I'm working a desk job, is it better for me to be looking at my screen, during the day, more so than once the sun goes down? Like, what's better? Because I know there's some people that just can't get away from this. They have to work on a computer. So how can they best utilize, improving their circadian biology?
I think outdoor breaks is probably going to be the most powerful thing. There was actually a study that showed that the more sunlight you get during the day, the less sensitive you become to this artificial isolated blue. Now, I always tell people that you should be very strict in blocking isolated blue. That doesn't mean you can just get sunlight all the time and, not have any impact on the other side of the duality when it comes to light and dark. But either way, I mean, you can use something like flux, f.lux on the computer. That'll block a substantial amount of blue if you have it on the best setting. You could use something called like one tap zap on Gumroad. That can put the screen on full red if you want. You can wear dark lens blue light blockers. But I think if you're outside, you don't need to do anything to a screen because the outdoor environment is going to be so saturated in the full spectrum that it just doesn't matter. It's going to mute it out essentially.
Okay, so it kind of offsets it.
Exactly. I think the most important thing is the indoor environment because you just don't have the high amount of lux, which is light intensity, and you don't have the full spectrum. And so there are various things you can do on that end, but I would suggest just more outdoor breaks, having some dark orange or red blue light blockers, and then, from that point, making it as dark as possible after nightfall as well.
Okay. You mentioned blue light blocking glasses. Some people, they're obsessed with them. They think they're God's gift. Some people think they're just a total joke. What are your thoughts on them? I mean, you just recommended them. So do you think that they are necessary?
I think for a lot of people, they are necessary because unless you're very strict on the circadian lighting front, especially after nightfall, you will need them to protect your eyes from sources of light that you can't necessarily change or control. And so I do think they're very necessary. I think only the dark orange and red are effective, with dark red being, blue blocking on steroids. I think dark orange is probably the sweet spot for most people, especially if they're going out and doing all sorts of things. The clear ones are useless. They don't actually block blue, so don't waste your money on that end. And the light yellow ones are pretty good for, I think, daytime use every once in a while. I usually don't use them. But either way, they're very effective. They've been shown to protect the circulatory melatonin from the pineal gland, which needs darkness. And I think if they're dark orange, dark red, they do a fantastic job of blocking isolated blue and green. And so, yeah, I'm all for them.
So when should I wear them?
Right after nightfall. So this will change depending on the season, but I suggest people use the My Circadian app, free version. I'm an affiliate for the app, but I don't like own it or anything like that. But it'll tell you basically the times of like when UVA comes out, when sunrise comes out, when nightfall occurs. And that is basically how I orient myself around the change in seasons. So whenever nightfall hits, it's straight dark mode. And that's when those blue blockers will go on, and I won't take them off until I go to bed.
Okay. And then, so you're wearing these indoors and outdoors?
Just indoors.
Just
You do
indoors.
not want any form of blue blockers outside because we want the full spectrum in.
Okay, got it. That makes complete sense. Okay, well, I've gone back and forth on blue blockers. I've heard lots of conflicting information, but if it's going to help dial everything in, I'm more than happy to wear them. Do you have a particular brand you like, or do you just think any of just the dark red and orange are the best?
I mean, you can get them from anywhere. You can get them from Alibaba, like for $5 a pair. I like Midwest Red Light Therapy for $40 a pair. I don't think you have to spend $150 a pair at all. So usually that's more so the branding. You're paying for the name. So there are many ways to do this, but I think that if you you have to tap into the intuitive feeling that it creates. Usually when people don't wear blue light blockers and I give them a pair to try, within 5 minutes they report that they start feeling tired. So I think it works very well from that angle if people are very hesitant about whether they do work or not.
Okay, makes sense. I'm gonna have to go buy some because I don't have any right now. I think an air fryer is a required kitchen tool for anybody following a carnivore diet or a low carb way of eating. The air fryer that I have in my kitchen is the Tasty. Tasty air fryer is a game changer. Not only does it go much higher in temperature than any other air fryer on the market, going up to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, but it also has a built-in temperature probe so you can get your meat cooked to the exact temperature you want every single time. Its sleek design is beautiful on your countertop, and it's also really easy to clean. Tasty just upgraded their basket to have a ceramic coating that is, as always, BPA and PFOA free. So you can rest easy knowing that you're not putting tons of toxic chemicals into your food when you are cooking it. Right now you can save $30 on your new Tasty air fryer by heading over to tasty.net/Jenny Mitich and using code Jenny30 at checkout. Link and code is in the show notes. I want to talk a little bit about vitamin D. So how is getting vitamin D from the sun different than supplementation? And what are your thoughts on supplementation in general?
So there is a massive difference between vitamin D3 from UVB, which is the only light wavelength range you can produce vitamin D from. And so you have to be out at a specific time when UVB is out to produce vitamin D3, compared to exogenous or supplemental vitamin D. So I think the most important thing, and a large part of this comes from the work of Dr. Alexander Wunsch, who's basically a German light biologist. And I think that if you look at the transport routes of both, vitamin D3 from the sun goes through the vitamin D binding protein, which is how the body is essentially made to synthesize vitamin D. And so there are a few conversion processes that vitamin D3 is going to go through from the sun. But when you look at vitamin D from a supplement, it goes through the lipoprotein route. And so that's essentially very ineffective or very inefficient. Depends on the person and, genetic profile and whatnot. But it's just not going to come close to the vitamin D you produce from the sun. And further to that point, there are also many different vitamin D metabolites that people don't think about. So there are water-soluble metabolites. Vitamin D3 is a fat-soluble vitamin or hormone, essentially. And I think people don't consider the metabolites because they only myopically focus on vitamin D3. But they're not thinking about all these different metabolites that the body produces, which carry you forward, especially into the wintertime. And so I think that's a really good description of the difference. We also have to understand that with vitamin D from a pill, it doesn't actually produce the same long-term chronic disease protection benefit as vitamin D from the sun, Because if you think about sunbathing, you're getting all these other benefits from infrared to endogenous melatonin to, POMC activation. You don't get that from a pill. And we really need to move away from this idea that we can solve the problem with a pill. I do think there is some use case for a vitamin D pill or a melatonin pill, but it's very few and far between. And so I'm not going to go out and demonize it, but I'm going to say it's just, it does not compare to the circadian perspective on sunbathing at all.
So I live in the Chicagoland area, and we have gray skies from like September to March or April. What can I do to best fill up my vitamin D in, the sunny times and not have to supplement through the winter?
So during the sunny times and sunny months, you essentially just want to maximize the amount of sunbathing that you do. You have to go about this very specifically through circadian protocol to avoid burns, to progressively build melanin so that you can handle more sunlight. But either way, once you get to that point, you essentially just want to maximize sunbathing as much as you can during those sunny months. And then essentially that is what will allow you to store vitamin D in the body fat, store the other metabolites in different areas of the body. And then that's when you head into wintertime where you really try to take advantage of endogenous melatonin. And so if you look through the research, melatonin can bind to the vitamin D receptor and create a lot of this, many of the same benefits as vitamin D. And so that's a very important point because it tells us that we are a cyclical, seasonal creature that evolved to go through different programs, essentially, depending on the season. And so how do we maximize endogenous melatonin? Number one, spending time outside, because near-infrared light at all times of day and all times of year will create this subcellular melatonin from the mitochondria, which has many different impacts. And then you also want to make it very dark after nightfall. And that's where the circulatory form comes in from the pineal gland, which needs darkness. And that's basically how you set yourself up for winter. I think there are other aspects to this. You can learn how to progressively get used to cold exposure. That is hypothesized through the work of Tom Seeger to actually produce UV biophotons, which then interact with sulfated cholesterol in the body, which then hypothesized to produce vitamin D3. And then outside of that, you can get it from food, although I don't think it's going to make that big of a difference. But yeah, it's going to mainly be that focus on endogenous melatonin and sunbathing during the sunny months.
Okay. You talk about cold exposure. Are you talking about cold plunges, or are you talking about the air?
It could be, it depends on the individual's level of adaptation, but whatever is cold enough to make you shiver, to make you have goosebumps, to give you that gasp reflex, I think is good enough. And of course, you have to approach this progressively. You don't just jump into an ice bath if you're not used to it. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. We have a cold plunge in our gym, and I was religiously using it until I don't know, last year. And I wonder, have you seen in any of your research anything about cold plunging and thyroid? Is it good for that, or is it bad?
Well, yeah. So I haven't gone too deep on it, but I will say I've come across some ideas that cold exposure does actually, what is it? Does it it actively promotes thyroid health through, I believe, the action of releasing active thyroid, or what is that, T3, T4?
A free T3 is the active.
Yeah, I think it promotes that within the body, and furthermore, it actively creates more mitochondria within brown fat, which are highly mitochondrial, which are dense in mitochondria, and so that actively promotes heat, which then has an impact on the system at large. But I do think that there's a lot to be said about the relationship between cold and thyroid, because I've seen people have transformations as well, but they've done so progressively. So, they didn't just go balls to the wall. They had a very intentional framework about it.
Yeah, for sure. You got to work your way up. It's intense. It is intense for sure. I want to talk a little bit about sunburns. So I recently saw one of your posts where you talked about how sunburns are actually related to a dysfunctional relationship with your own circadian biology. Can you expand on that a little bit? And then just talk about how we can naturally avoid sunburns without using sunscreen.
So I wrote an article on this called the Solar Callus Guide on my Substack, and it runs people through how to avoid sunburns and how to build more melanin progressively. So number one, I think a sunburn is just an indication that you are disrupted from a circadian standpoint and you don't spend enough time outside. because that usually indicates you don't have enough melanin. And what's interesting is that all skin types can produce melanin. This is a very powerful truth that not many people know about, but even lighter skinned people, redheads, they can produce enough pheomelanin, which is the type of melanin that they specifically have. You just have to have the right circadian approach and sunbathe wisely. But outside of that, I think that if you progressively start with AM sunlight exposure in the morning time, which is rich in red and infrared, that is what primes the skin through the production of uricanic acid and filigrein, along with some other compounds that have various protective mechanisms. They're moisturizing to the skin, and they basically, that morning sunlight sets the stage for the alignment of your circadian skin clocks. And the circadian skin clocks they basically explain function and repair comprehensively. And so we start out with that. Then you want to microdose midday UV, or at least UV starting in the early morning. This will depend on you as an individual. It's N equals 1. If you are a redhead who has no experience sunbathing, maybe 30 seconds is enough. Maybe 1 minute's enough. But you basically want to approach it in the same way you approach progressive overload with training. And so, you prepare yourself for the stressor, aka a warm-up. That's what the AM sunlight serves as. And then you expose yourself to a stressor properly. So that's what, the workout will serve as. And then you recover from the stressor, which in this analogy is like sleep. Sleep is essentially recovering from exercise. And there's also something to be said about blocking that isolated blue after sunset and making it dark, because the skin actually repairs itself at night. And so this is how we want to be very comprehensive in terms of our understanding. And then typically avoid use of sunglasses, sunscreen, contacts, prescription glasses. All of those things will impact the system at large to then increase the risk of burning. And so, yeah, I think that's a pretty good description of it. But either way, there is a framework and it is possible.
Okay. And you can also just cover up with clothes if you're starting to feel like a little bit of pink on your skin, or if you're darker toned, a little bit of warmth.
Exactly. Forgot to mention that, but shade, clothing, those are two of the best things in terms of protection against burns once you've had enough sun exposure.
I always say translucently pale. I do get tan though. I just have to work on it. I have been working on that. I was in Florida for 6 weeks and I've built a nice base tan. So I'm happy about that. I did have a question about sunscreen though. So since I was like 13 years old, I've been wearing sunscreen just on my face, specifically to avoid wrinkles. And I still do that. I don't wear it anywhere else, just on my face. What are your thoughts on that and the, idea that sun exposure can cause wrinkles?
I have some very real reservations about the idea that full spectrum sunlight inherently causes wrinkles. I think if you abuse sunlight exposure, you spend like 3 hours outside during high UV, that, UV and blue light are definitely high energy wavelengths that impact the skin. But I don't think they inherently cause that. I think that's more so a problem of the fact that people are inside most of the time and their physiology is not adapted to that. They don't have enough melanin and whatnot. So if you want to use sunscreen to avoid wrinkles, I think that I'm big on informed consent. I will say that the most problematic thing on that end is, number one, what is the quality of the sunscreen? Number two, we do have to understand that it does change the sun's full spectrum. And so over time, if that's done chronically, that will have some very real effects on the skin, which could potentially lead to various things like melanoma or squamous and basal cell carcinoma. So I'm all about informed consent on that end. People have the right to make their choices. I just want them to have all the information at hand. But I do want them to understand that if they're worried about wrinkles and hyperpigmentation and all these manifestations, they should be more worried about circadian disruption and the isolated blue light from technology and lighting indoors and the manipulated or altered spectrums from low emission glass, for example.
Great. Good to know. Definitely good to know. Okay. We've got the average American here, somebody listening to this podcast. I want you to give them your top advice on how they can improve their relationship with the sun. Starting today, what could they do? What is super easy to do to get this started?
I would say watching sunrise for sure. I think that if you look at how many things sunrise touches on, from creating neurotransmitters to regenerating the melatonin cycle, I think that has some very tangible effects for people to see immediately. And so that's number one. And so I would usually recommend waking up 5 to 10 minutes prior to sunrise, and then getting outside immediately after they wake up. And so no sunglasses, no contacts, no prescription lenses, eyes and skin in the game. Again, there's no UV during that time, so you're not going to burn. In fact, that is the time to create the preparation for upcoming UV when it does come out. And then from that point, I think being outside during UVA rise, which typically happens an hour and a half after sunset or sunrise, is a very important thing, because I feel like a lot of people struggle on the mental health aspect of things. And knowing that UV is absorbed by those aromatic amino acids to create neurotransmitters, I think that's a very important point that people could benefit from immensely. And outside of that, you just want to spend as much time as you can outdoors. If you have to go to work early in the morning, open the windows. Open the windows to allow the full spectrum in. You don't have to look straight at the sun, which is otherwise known as sun gazing at that time, but you can look peripherally at it a few degrees off the center of the actual sun. And so that's probably the biggest thing that I can recommend outside of making it very dark after nightfall.
And then how long do people need to stay outside at sunrise so that they can watch that? Like, what's the optimal amount of time?
I say the more the better, but minimum 20 minutes.
Okay, and then for the second part of it with the UV, an hour to hour and a half after sunrise, how long do they have to stay outside at that point?
Along the same lines, 20, 25 minutes. I mean, to be honest, 30 minutes is probably an even better benchmark. But yeah, whatever you can get, just try to get that.
Okay. And then for people that implement this, because that's not super difficult. I mean, if people aren't early birds, it's going to be hard to get up. But, for people that implement this, how soon can they see changes and improvements in their health?
From my standpoint, immediately. I mean, whenever I have like 4 to 5 hours of sleep, like I just had that a few nights ago. I slept for 4.5 hours. I initially felt really groggy in the morning, wasn't really feeling it, and wasn't really getting the day started as well as I wanted to, being sleep deprived. I immediately headed outside, and this happens every single time without fail. Within 5 to 10 minutes, maybe even 15 minutes of being outside and watching sunrise, it feels like I'm not sleep deprived at all. It feels like I've gotten 8.5 hours of sleep. And so that's one example of how you can get immediate biofeedback, especially on the energy level front. People will typically notice better sleep, no insomnia, better ability to fall asleep, longer lasting sleep, and deeper sleep within a couple days for sure. But I do think the circadian system is very sensitive to these changes. And so the biofeedback will happen relatively quickly, especially when you consider heliotherapy of the past. Like, in the early 1900s, you had people like Auguste Rollier who would put people on a sunbathing framework in practice. And these are people who were 2-3 weeks away from death because they had lupus vulgaris, which is tuberculosis of the skin. And within 4, 5, 6 months, I mean, they're fully healed, which is crazy to think about. And so all of this ties into mitochondrial bioenergetics, because mitochondria are the root cause. And I think that the mitochondria respond very, very quickly to this work, which is good because it means there's no barrier to entry, essentially.
Right. How much is consistency important? Like, say somebody starts to do this, they're doing it for a couple of weeks, and then they kind of fall off. Like, how important is it for them to get back into it?
Everything. It's everything, because the circadian system is all about timing. And, everything in life is all about momentum as well. And so if you can manage to be consistent, then you'll just get greater reward and benefit from this work. But yeah, the timing is very important. I would much rather have somebody stick with a consistent routine as opposed to having, let's say, bedtime or wake up time all over the place. Because the more synchronized your circadian clocks are, starting from the SCN in the brain, which is the master circadian clock, and then the peripheral clocks linked to every tissue, organ, cell in the body, the better your health will be from a general standpoint.
So it sounds like a lot of people are like focusing really hard on the diet and the exercise, and they should be equally focusing on this circadian biology.
Well, it's even deeper than that, because the exercise and the food is controlled by circadian biology. And so exercise and food are what we call Zeitgebers, which are external circadian cues. And so there is a right and wrong time to exercise according to circadian timing. And there's definitely a right and wrong time to when you eat, meal timing. And then that also ties into various things like how you respond from a blood sugar standpoint to a meal. Like if you have a meal in the morning when you're most insulin sensitive, you're going to get good benefit. But if you have it at midnight, you can turn yourself into a diabetic pretty quickly through that method.
Oh, 100%. My husband and I both wear continuous glucose monitors because we're always running experiments. And we were doing a home remodel and we were eating dinner really late. Now, granted, it was keto, it was low carb, but it affected our blood glucose was much, much higher because of that late meal. That's just a fact. That's just the way it works.
Yeah. I mean, beta, what is it? Pancreas cells, all are under circadian control. You have blood sugar or blood sugar response has a diurnal variation, insulin response. I mean, everything within that realm is under circadian control. And so it only makes sense.
Yeah. So I guess instead of diet and exercise being number one, we need to focus on circadian stuff first.
It sounds crazy to people, but this is stuff that I'm trying to get people into. And I think it really is true. It's the keystone pillar that holds everything together.
Yeah, I now understand why Dr. Wiedemann was like, I think that this is more important than food.
Yeah. And it's not pseudoscience, by the way. Like if if people go through the literature, they go to PubMed, NCBI, Cell, this is laid out in a perfect manner for people to understand. It might be complex. You might have to put things together, which is what I feel like a large part of my work is doing for people. But there's no barrier to entry here. You can find those answers and you can see it laid out perfectly there.
Yeah, why don't you share how people can find you, because your work is awesome, and if anyone out there wants to learn more about this, you need to follow Zaid.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's Zaid K Dahhaj, so ZaidK Dahhaj on all platforms, Substack, Twitter, Instagram. And yeah, I mean, I just lay out a tremendous amount of information. Again, I am obsessed, so I'm very neurotic in my ability to put out information. And either way, I think it benefits both myself and people.
Yeah, I love it. I've learned a lot just in the last month that I've been following you. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I've learned a lot just from this interview, and I'll definitely put all of the links to your socials in the show notes so people can find you as well.
Thank you so much. Awesome convo.